Sign up for free Stratfor Intelligence. Simply enter your email address to receive free reports each week.
Hello, my name is Reva, Bhalla, and today I'm here with Rodger Baker to discuss the latest developments in Syria and how this conflict is playing out well beyond Syria's borders. So Rodger, we have a very interesting editorial from Russian President Vladimir Putin, which made its way into the New York Times. He basically makes the case that the United States needs to not make a mockery of the UN Security Council, and he undermined the US president's message on American exceptionalism. What were your thoughts?
I think that if the op-ed had been written by anybody in America, it probably would have matched the way in which many Americans are talking about what's going on. It fits right into the debate. I think, though, that coming from the Russian president, coming from this particular Russian president with his history, with the history of Russia and Georgia, that this may backfire. We're already seeing coming out of Congress some very strong opposition to his statement. So even though there's been a lot of complaints about the way in which President Obama has handled the situation, I think that Putin may have overstepped just a little bit with this op-ed.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it stood out to me how much Russia is trying to make itself out to be the pragmatic alternative to the United States. So making it appear as if the U.S. is the bull in the China shop. Russia is the very calm, collected statesman to handle this affair. But you know, there is some limits to that perception, that bluff that Russia is trying to create.
Well, I think in the end, the biggest limiter is anybody can talk, anybody can say we need to have negotiations. Can you back up the negotiations in case there's an error or a failure, or can you enforce whatever you negotiate? And in the end, Russia has very limited power, very limited reach in the world of enforcement. And the United States, whether it wants to or not, whether it intends to be or not, remains the strongest global power out there. And it keeps being put upon the United States, or the United States takes on itself, to become the enforcer.
Well, let's drill into the Russian proposal then, right? Because this is the big test for Russia to actually be this grand mediator in this conflict. So the devil in the details, right? The logistics of actually going in, securing chemical weapon stockpiles in the middle of a civil war. We're talking at least 1,000 metric tons of chemical weapon stockpiles spread across at least 50 sites across the country, many inactive battle zones. Is there any precedence for this kind of operation?
For this type of operation, there's nothing. We've never seen anything like this, not on this scale, in an active war zone. So how do you send in the inspectors? You may be able to gather inspectors. Can you put them into an active war zone? Or do you have to have some form of ceasefire before you can even put the inspectors in? Once they're in, how do you ensure their security? What types of forces do you put in to protect them, to secure the facilities? How are you sure that those are all of the facilities? So in some ways, one of the things I think that's being overlooked is that, yes, there's a lot of discussion now about the details, how many forces do you need and things like that. But do you have to stop the civil war to make this happen?
Can you?
And can you? And then who are these peacekeepers or forces that are going to be securing the chemical weapons facilities going to be fighting now, or going to be protecting them from?
Right.
They're apparently not protecting them from the Syrian government and the Syrian forces. That means they're protecting them from the rebel forces who the U.S. is supplying weapons to.
Right. And when we go into the ground, when we're talking about ground troops, I mean, that is the sensitive topic to this whole conflict. I mean, the idea of ground troops for the American public, of course, that's the American public's red line. We've seen that with France, skittishness with the UK, the Germans, even Russia, I don't think is prepared to actually send in ground troops to protect these inspectors. So we'll have to see what comes out of that proposal. In the end, Obama may be backed into a unilateral strike and may not even have congressional backing to do it.
It may be, but we'll have to see how Putin's op-ed plays out and see whether or not, for example, that if the Russians put this proposal out there and they push it forward, and for the next month or 2 months, there's all of these efforts to try to make it work, and it becomes very clear that there really was no concrete plan and that it's an untenable solution. It may be that the Russians lose the credibility in this, and the French and even the British come back to the United States, and the United States may be able to rebuild some of that coalition that it seems to have lost.
Although I'd argue that the European leaders in this conflict do not have the same level of support that the U.S. was probably anticipating. And, the effects of the European crisis, we have very unpopular leaders right now in Europe. So it'll be very difficult for them to bypass their own parliaments and go ahead with it.
I think for all sides, this is one of these situations where there's absolutely no good solutions.
Right. So in the no good solutions, when we look at how the rest of the world is looking at this, let's start with U.S. allies and the credibility of the U.S. ultimatum. So everywhere from, let's say, in the immediate region, of course, Israel, Saudi Arabia, they're trying to force the U.S. to make good on its threats, that there is a red line when it comes to Syria, when it comes to Iran. But even beyond that, we're looking at countries like Poland, like Azerbaijan, like South Korea, who need to know that U.S. threats actually mean something.
Yeah, I think the president, the secretary of state have framed this discussion less as a discussion about Syria and more as a discussion about the credibility of the United States. And in doing so, it already was in some sense that way, but now they've made it very public. You go back to something like the Korean War in 1950. And the U.S., depending upon how you want to read what the statements were, the U.S. had basically said South Korea is not within our sphere of interest. There was the invasion by the North Koreans. The U.S. said, well, we actually have to act to be able to reinforce to our European allies, to be able to reinforce to the Japanese that we truly are going to be there, that we're going to give that sense of security. I think what these countries are looking for is the U.S. willing to take the risks necessary to back these issues that it says it's going to back. And so for South Korea, they've seen the U.S. be very weak, for example, on North Korea over the past several years, to back down in the face of just verbal opposition from China.
Yeah, but then there's another side to it, right? Because while they do want the U.S. to deliver that message, they don't want the U.S. to involve itself in a war that threatens to pull the U.S. further into another Middle East imbroglio after a decade of wars in the Islamic world, because that is exactly what has distracted the U.S. from other priorities in these other areas of the world where the U.S. has been trying to turn its attention. So no good answer either way there. But what about U.S. adversaries? What do you think, for example, North Korea is thinking and watching all this?
Well, I think when the North Koreans see this, there's two things that they're looking at right now. They're looking at Syria and they're looking at Libya. And the North Koreans say Libya is a very clear case that the Libyans effectively gave up all of their weapons of mass destruction type programs. They were welcomed into the international community. And then when there was a little bit of a stir up in the social situation, the international community bombed them, killed them, and kicked them out. Mm-hmm. Syria now has the potential to give up its chemical weapons, but that doesn't guarantee that this isn't going later to turn into something that's going to be a war where the U.S. is going to end up attacking the Syrian government and attacking their troops. And so as the North Koreans look at this, I think for them it's reinforcing the importance actually of maintaining their WMD program rather than eliminating it. They don't see that the West is trustworthy in allowing a country, once it's given those up, to truly enter the international community.
And that's an interesting lesson for Iran. Obviously, it's further behind the North Korea in its nuclear development, but they're trying to use this intervention as a platform for the negotiation it's been seeking with the United States. The problem is the timing is never right for that negotiation. The U.S. doesn't want to negotiate with an Iran or a North Korea when it feels cornered. So even while Iran may attempt through the new president to start up a new dialogue, I think you're right. They have to question whether they can really go that far in concessions on the nuclear program and whether it's more in their interest to build a credible deterrent if the concessions don't actually guarantee that you won't be bombed sooner or later, right? So I think everybody at this point is going to be recalculating their intentions toward these nuclear programs. But I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you, Rodger, for your time. And thank you all for joining us today. We'll be watching the Syrian developments closely, which you can find in our analysis on Stratfor.com. And we'll see you next time.